guys, masterxeon here, and in this video I'm going to be going over the design process I used in constructing this robot I'm about to begin showing you. So these pictures aren't in any particular order, but this is just basically the design process and how the renders evolved, just from the beginning of just starting off with a simple cube, and just going through the stages of just expanding onto it, while also just testing out different render setups and just basically trying to get the nicest result possible. So this is one of the earlier ones that kind of shows just the initial concept, and this is probably the actual first one at the end of the first part. But at the end it'll actually be closer to that, and ending actually on this first part with this. So before we begin, just a couple of things. Now, the first model of a robot I ever done was this one, which was a long time ago. In fact, it doesn't tell me when. And it doesn't tell me when. Why doesn't it tell me when? Jerks. Alright, well, this was a long time ago. I mean, I first had gotten into 2.5 at this point. Just my hard surfacing skills at this time were just horrible. So continuing on, later in life I discovered cycles, or cycles became discovered by the world and was realized by Brett von Lommel and has just changed the world. So I continued through my endeavors of trying to make robots and things like that, even went after like a more stylized look, which this is actually one of my favorite pictures ever. But the whole technique I went through in this was, model the character, model the gun, and then sketched a robot in Sketch 2, Scribbler 2, and then mapped it to planes and built a robot out of it. And then even later I went and tried to make like a hard surface boy robot, but the design element I felt used wasn't strong enough. So while it is a visually appealing render, it isn't an actually attractive render, and this thing is impractical. But there are some cool things to it, but it's very Tron-like, so that's something that I just wasn't a big fan of. And so recently I did this video, which this robot also looks pretty good. I mean, it's appealing on the eyes. It looks like it would fight in Pacific Rim. However, there are some design elements that are inherent to it as flaws as a result of the workflow of kit bashing. So in the end, the goal is to get to this point. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into Blender and begin. Alright, so jumping in here and beginning. So as always, I start off with a cube when I'm modeling in 3D. It's just preferred medium for me, and using eye for inset and extruding and scaling, I was able to just start roughing in the shape of a torso, just simplistic polygonal modeling techniques. So I'm not really thinking too much about geometry as usual. I'm just focusing on getting the forms and shapes of the body and just going from there. So after building the neck area, I begin to work on the back just by adding in bevels. I can add in some smoothness and begin interpolating it, just kind of dividing at my own pace really whenever I model now. So, this is going to be a very long video. In fact, this is only part 1. In fact, it's like 2 hours long. So, grab yourself a big bag of chips and a bucket of popcorn, and you're going to watch me shred a robot. So, of course, as always, sped up to 300%. just to get this taken care of, because narrating 6 hours would drive me crazy, especially in post. And for the polysphere that I used on the arm, I just dropped in a cube, W subdivide, then Shift Alt S to turn it to a sphere, and now I'm just connecting it to the body. So Blender's got a lot of interesting modeling upgrades that have made things a lot easier. One is the ability to bridge edge loops that are not the same size. That's something that I never really had a big problem with, but I always wish that it wasn't that way. And yeah, that's great. Another thing is that whenever you're retopologizing in your end panel in edit mode, there's now an option to look at it in wireframe mode, which is basically topology mode for doing this, so you don't have to use X-ray for retopology. It's kind of hard to explain, but you should definitely check it out. So right here, I'm just building a segment of the arms, just trying to establish just the shape of the person I want to create. You know, by no means this geometry isn't final. The longer it stays, the better it works as a placeholder. But everything I have here, of course, is built to be replaced. So prior to doing this, I didn't do very much concepting. However, I did spend a lot of time going through Pinterest, checking out various web pages. If you go to my channel page, you can see a link to my Pinterest where you can see the kind of references that I'm always looking at. And Pinterest is a good page to go to whenever you're just needing inspiration, because sometimes I just look at pictures, I'm like, you know, I bet I could do that in Blender. And bam, I have my task for today. But it definitely helps me get over block, you know, because I try to build assets when I don't feel like making characters, and build characters when I don't feel like building assets, and sculpt when I don't feel like modeling, and all this moving back and forth. But polymodeling will always be my main thing, because I feel I'm pretty good at it. So the head is something that I kind of tried to think up on the spot. Wasn't entirely pleased with it, but I just felt that I wanted just something there to be a head. The original idea was to have kind of like a skull mask, like, you know, like some hollow Ichigo kind of stuff, but in the end I didn't want to go that way, and I went for a completely different design. In the current stages, I'm actually pretty pleased with the progress, but as of this recording, I haven't even added arms yet. And voila. And for this part, I'm just knifing my way around and just pulling it in. While I am modeling a robot, I do want the forms to be anatomical like a human. So I am, you know, pulling in it's just different shapes based off of anatomy. Right here, just going to my user preferences, try to set my export to application. So keep in mind, you know, every time you see me move and invert, and it turns to a little yellow stick, I am using edge slide with GG, which I'm always talking about. Bevel is Control B, one of my favorite tools. Whenever it comes to hard surface, there's a couple of techniques that are important to remember, right? Like, you don't want to extrude directly in, you know, you want to extrude, inset it, pull it in, then extrude it in, right? Because you want the light to basically catch the model in various complexities, which will help your AO maps and scratches and everything that you try to add in there, and just basically add an additional level of detail that will make your model more plausible. So this is something that I use heavily in my modeling. Heavy uses of bevels, inclined planes, just basically just optical helpers to kind of guide the viewer's eyes. Alright, so continuing, and as subsurf doesn't look very good, and slide around. So, I mean, for the most part, you see, basically I'm just moving verts, beveling, just trying to get a shape. So I'm not even so much looking at the front of the model as much as I'm looking at the edges as I work my way around it. And now, things get interesting. Turn on the matte cap. Get my polish brush and just start hitting it. Now, these days, I'm ashamed to say that I spend a little bit too much time in ZBrush sculpting instead of Blender. So this whole project was really me coming back to Blender to show that, you know, I'm not by any means abandoning my favorite program of all time. However, I have definitely expanded vastly in the software that I use to try to get a better understanding of just 3D in general and the workflows that are used. I mean, there's people who just are very amazing. There's one guy in particular, Scott Peterson, who uses Scott Robinson, and the things that he comes up with are just ultimately random. And they're just amazing videos. Like, might put a link of them in the description or something like that. So whenever it comes to sculpting, in this particular stage, I was determined to just scratch in the forms, not care about flattening it and polishing the bevels or anything like that. I was pretty sure if I kept the topology simple and just hit those key edges, then I would be able to actually get the form without a whole lot of effort. So that's pretty much what I'm doing right here. However, I do of course go and polish a couple of pieces, just see how it feels, you know. It's been a while since I was in Blender, just dabbing standard my way through things. And trying to polish some bevels in there. But, I mean, you know, this piece doesn't matter. It's just going to be retopoed, forgotten about. But I'm really making this video more to just kind of have a better robot video in my name, because the one previous, while it was impressive, somewhat, it was built through kit bashing, so the robot wasn't practical and not suitable for real production. So this one is more of a production quality robot, I feel, in my opinion. So I try to go in and put in additional details to really just make for a much more interesting render. And I just come in, you know, hardening up details. Trying to just get an idea of what kind of shape I'm going to go for here. So even if the pieces don't look right in the viewport or look too blocky, I can always merge them together, use a lattice world modifier on it, and just modify it as a whole and just shape it into place without losing the continuity between multiple pieces, and do it non-destructively without the use of a modifier, which is pretty good. And so retopology, I just jump in, throw down a plane, delete everything, and just control click. Grab whatever vertices created by control clicking, and then use the mirror and snap it in. So using, you know, the power of F2, obviously, and just extruding, turning corners, and just covering the shape with the simplest geometry possible. Simple enough I can create a nice inset, and simple enough I can just deal with it and maybe have multiple pieces and crease it very nice without having to go through a whole lot of pain and agony. So now I got the piece in local mode, and I'm just creasing my way through it. I try putting some try using some blender creases to see how that works out. It's kind of weird, but I still go through with it. And so that's my first piece. And now to continue moving forward. So with this sort of project, you know, it can be a little daunting at first when you want to make something like this, you know, for where exactly would you begin, but it really is enjoyable to be able to just jump into Blender and just throw down a cube and be able to turn it to what you want. I mean, there's a lot of times where I come in and I actually end up with a horrible looking result that I'm not pleased with. And it's nothing to do with the program, it's just coming in without a plan. So, like I mentioned earlier, Pinterest is definitely the way to go as far as getting inspired and getting references when it comes to 3D modeling. So, be sure to check out my page that's also linked on my YouTube. And so as far as the accuracy of the snapping, I just want to make sure that the pieces aren't going to be affected by, I mean, I don't want the pieces to have any visible gaps in between that will actually cause issues. However, I don't want it to be completely solid geometry, so that's why I'm not using solidify in my normal inset technique that works pretty well. I mean, whenever it comes to topology for something like this, you don't even really have to put a whole lot of thought into it. It's just dropping in lines, connecting faces, keeping everything quads, making sure the loops are going the right way. But really, you get better with this sort of thing just through experimentation and just, you know, breaking the ordinary. But definitely watching artists who are much better is definitely the fastest way to learn. Um, so now I'm trying to work my way up to the chest so that way we can begin rendering it out. So with the process of modeling, I like to jump back and forth between rendering, compositing, testing out, between rigging, compositing, other aspects of it, props. I do a lot of different things to try to avoid getting burnt out whenever working on a scene, because opening the same scene over and over can definitely drive you crazy after a while. But I have found personally that me compared to most people on a professional level, I definitely move through my development and compositing and rendering processes a lot quicker. Instead of camping on a model for a week, I do move pretty fast and try to, you know, be making something new every other day or something. So my goal is to just one day say that I'm the fastest modeler. So in the other window, I have a local mode that's showing just the pieces as I assemble them. So you can see that it is coming out pretty nice. Um, it's just a matter of just repeating this, making sure they're all connected. And the true beauty of it is the simplicity of the geometry allows me to retopo this rough, poorly shredded mesh. So, I mean, whenever you're sculpting to concept this sort of stuff, you don't even really have to get that detailed if you don't want to. And this is something that I'm not going to say that maybe I'm late to find out, but, you know, maybe I never really put a lot of thought into exactly how low I can go. So this process was pretty propelling personally, because the results did get better and better, even more so than I expected. I was just going to make just a basic robot, but it ended up turning into something much more impressive, and I personally felt compelled to see this all the way through. So hopefully y'all are enjoying this, because it is a long one. Like I said, it's looking like it's going to be like a 2-hour video, so this is like my masterxeon modeling full-length feature film. Just kidding, but back to the video. So just extruding faces out, trying to connect it. Everything's a little dense there, which isn't very good, but I'll just deal with it. And keep in mind that with a loop like the one that you see here in the center, I also have the choice of possibly going in, turning off magnet, Alt-S'ing to scale it out, and then bevel it, and that'll add a really convincing crease that'll work for the shape as far as the light passing over it and going through the form. So these sort of light catchers is what I call them, that just interact with just the specular and reflect things back to the viewer to add visual interest to it is basically the goal that I go for here. Because, you know, whenever you're first modeling robots, you have no real concept of that, so your models are going to be more planar and therefore boring whenever the lighting hits it. So by adding complexity and bevels to each of the pieces when you segment it, and just having things like bolts to just add additional care and detail to it, you can really take a basic looking concept and turn it into something very amazing. You know, control and flip them normals. I don't think I flip normals enough in this, but I don't think it becomes much of a problem. Another thing I enjoy in Blender is turning on auto merge, which is one of the buttons down at the bottom of the panel, and by activating it, it allows you to connect one vert to another vert and it'll automatically merge. So I'll just apply a level of subdivision, deal with it, add in the pieces I want, and then all the loops that are erroneous, I will slide those at other loops and automatically delete them without having to press X. And just sliding them at each other and having the power to remove them is one of the other improvements that has made Blender the ultimate modeling application. I mean, I'm determined to get down a good understanding of 3ds Max and Modo, and you know, try to get to the bottom of, you know, what is really the best way to go when it comes to modeling. But for now, I am pretty strong on my workflow with Blender of just being used to the interface. Absolute confidence in knowing that, you know, my files will never be corrupted and I'll never have to deal with license keys. I mean, as a amateur artist trying to, you know, work his way into something much more professional, it's definitely important to be able to show absolute proficiency in, you know, your preferred software of choice. So for this particular piece, it took a little bit of work to get to work, but I ended up pulling it off. So like I said, gaps in the pieces will definitely help the form. However, it does have to be something underneath to stop the light from penetrating and shadows from catching too deeply inside and things like that, which will give away the hollowness of the form. So my full intention with this was to actually make it transform out of a backpack. However, with the complexity of all the pieces involved, having it slide around and disappear in a backpack is going to be the ultimate magic trick. Like, I'm going to have to make my model go in a box and then transform. Like, just go in a phone booth or something, come out of it exploding. But, you know, back to the model. So, connecting verts and extruding, just tracing these pieces. So, with these modeling sessions, I usually get in, work on things for about 4 hours straight, get fidgety in my chair, get up and run away, have a sandwich, watch a show, come back, do more modeling. But the most important thing is the amount of interaction that I have. As a 3D artist, I used to spend a lot of time just in my room by myself, just goofing off. And, you know, I never really thought about the whole social networking aspect of 3D. So nowadays I am connected with a very interesting group of artists who are much, much better than me, who are just interesting guys that I'm able to just sit and chat about 3D or rant on movies or whatever, but, you know, good times. And it's something that I'm working on expanding into possibly being something for Blender. So if it's something that you're interested in, definitely mention it in the comments, and I could see about getting an open source room made. We have some sessions, but being able to meet up live and collaborate while working on blend files definitely helps keeps the fire alive while getting critique in real time while sharing your screen via Google Hangouts and allowing yourself to get critique and rapidly improve quickly. And so I'm able to just say, be working, joking around or whatever, and pause and be like, hey, how's this model look? Oh, this model's great. This model sucks. You can improve this. This face doesn't look right. That's the kind of critique that, I look for whenever it comes to modeling. If you tell me it's good, then maybe you're not looking at it right, because as an artist in development, I expect mistakes to be in all of my works, which is why I'm always updating my works. HS on my studies, on my head files are always referencing head studies, because the current head that I sculpt now looks good to me today, but I'll hate it tomorrow. And so I'm steadily getting to the point where I'm not going to have artist hangover as much, where I wake up the next day and I look at the model and I'm like, what the heck is this? And I'm just displeased with it. So we slapped the candy paint matte cap on it, and things start looking very pretty. And at this point, I was also beginning to feel very proud of my progress with this model and how it was coming. So now I'm modeling at double speed, got to get in there. Recording this time lapse, taking forever. But, I want to someday be the person known as making the ultimate mech video. Like, y'all will someday see someone asking, what's the best video about making a robot? And I want to be the guy that did it. Just to be good at it, so I can have my hard surface badge, and I can go back to modeling people again, so I can put them inside of these suits. But I am working on quite a few small endeavors these days, so I know that I have quite a large audience watching my videos, so we should definitely, hang out and just work on getting better at Blender together, try to bring a more interactive scene, because it's already happening with other programs, and the fact that, the Blender community is remaining basement dwellers, being non-interactive, is definitely hindering our progress, so definitely worth getting at me about. So originally I was going to make this as a large mech bust and then just leave it at that, but I also realized I can add on a little bit more than that. But the abdomen area was something I figured I'd struggle with, but by just going with typical human anatomy shapes, I was able to come up with my forms, because if I went for something completely unlike a human, it would look very unnatural, right? Like, imagine if I flipped the torso upside down and put the arms on it, and it would be horrible. So thank God we didn't go that route. But you can go on BlendSwap, download a base mel mesh, cut the pieces out, add solidify, put a bevel modifier, set it to angle of 60, and you could start making something very similar to this very quickly. And just slide your edges at each other, especially on the down slopes, and you will see very hard edges come in very quickly. But just know that every break in the form and the shadows, every break in the form adds to the shadows and to the light. So the more angle changes that happen smoothly, the more of a chance it's going to catch the reflection of a gobo or a mesh light that I have conveniently placed in the scene in order to get that new Mac Ferrari look that I like in my renders. Whenever it comes to the materials, there's a paint shaders file on BlendSwap that is superb. I use it all the time. It's my favorite file. I've already studied the nodes enough to remake them, but the fact of the matter is they just did a better job. So just why not use them? They're giving them away for free. Go and get them. So don't even imitate me when you go about this. Just get a base mesh and just cut the pieces out and just do some extrudes, and you'll see that this technique is something that with a little bit of practice can easily be done. And so the real things that matter when it comes to making it an actually good model really is going to come in the form and the interest that comes with level 2. So if you don't know what level 2 is, then just keep watching, because right now everything's being modeled, subdivided, looks smooth, but what we're going to do is come in, apply subdivides, and then start just meshing details onto the surface. And that's the kind of stuff that you will see in, what I call hard surface porn, like Metal Gear Solid Rising. If you've played that game, that is the most beautiful robot game ever. I mean, someone was showing me Hawken today, so I think I might jump on that after I make this video. But Metal Gear Solid Revengeance was a very good hard surface game. Like the rivets they put in the chest and all those details is something to learn from. So when I'm playing Halo, I'm enjoying the first person shooter, but I'm seeing what they're doing. I'm looking at those rocks, even though people are killing me while I'm looking at them, and just taking notes of things that I find appealing and just adding it to my repertoire, which brings me back to Pinterest. Another thing about it that makes it preferable to Google Images is you don't get watermarked images. Watermarked images drive me crazy. I'm running through Google search. I'm just looking for a pretty girl's face just to see what her nose looks like. And I have to deal with watermarked images? No, I could just go to Pinterest and it's just not happening. So, sorry to keep jumping off topic. I promise I'm not being endorsed by them or anything, but it is definitely something we're checking out. So, more extruding and connecting, but you'll see eventually I'll get tired and take a break from this process and start going after other aspects of it. And this particular piece I'm not pleased with even at this current time, because I feel it was a cop-out piece that doesn't follow the human anatomy and goes up into it. But I come up with some very interesting workflows, I think, by the end of the video, talking about just basically how to imitate muscles and coils and use it just with the power of lattices to fit it into place. But I think in the end the model was too busy, or at least that's what my girlfriend said. So credential loops, right? And on these edges, you see the corners of this piece, and I'm creasing the edges. I could go about it the I don't care way, which means that you can actually bevel them. So you can select those edges, bevel it, and it'll turn the interconnected quads at the ends of those poles into n-gons, which is annoying, but hear me out. They will look very nice if you just don't break the flatness continuity that you'll get with it. So if you don't know what I mean there, definitely just try it out with modeling. It's just an endless experiment, but for the most part, sorry about that. I kind of lost my thought there. Had to get something to drink. All right, so now I'm just toppling over the helmet. So just the smoothness that it gives me from the subsurf allows me to get a pretty nice and relaxed result. So these are things that I'm counting on with it while I'm just tracing the shape. So when it comes to retopology, I have seen how it's done in Modo. I've seen how it's done in TopoGun. I hear everyone's opinions. I see how it's done in ZBrush. I even tried in ZBrush. Blender has the best retopo ever. It's just integrated with 3D so perfectly. I mean, you get Modo, you have to turn on surface snapping, set the point, and geometry snap, and background constraints. It is, it's just complicated. But For the helmet, I had a pretty different idea at the very beginning. I was trying to go for something kind of like the Cyborg Ninja on Metal Gear, but in the end, I wanted to break away from licensed intellectual properties and make something of my own design. So, in the end, I kind of free modeled and came up with an absolutely marvelous design. So here's a modeling design tip for me. You have a model, don't know what to put on it, put a put an enormous sphere in the middle of its forehead, and you have saved your model. Don't believe me? Try it out. But don't do it. Everybody probably does it. It's just that easy though. But I mean, for a moment I did struggle with some of the design elements of making the head, but in the end I just kind of realized some of the rules that actually make robot heads appealing, like the simplicity and glowing lights and ventilation, and especially the materials. The materials that I ended up choosing in the end helped sell the way that the model went, and in the end ensured that the project came out successful. So keep in mind that I'm repeatedly turning off my mirror, because if you don't turn the mirror off, things get annoying and painful. Trying to just set some angled insets, those are always interesting light catchers, and AO loves them. So if you don't know what I mean there, definitely try it out. So with angled surfaces, with circular divots, it's definitely something there that you want to spend some time checking into. But just looking at mechs that you admire will definitely get you up to speed on understanding it. So for the arms, I went with a very simplistic design, but I kind of was thinking, Metroid, Samus Aran kind of circular, but maybe not so big, and without the spikes on it, not heavy metal, and maybe take this piece and cut it in half. But here's the typical workflow that I would use for just making random hard surface stuff. Just put a solidify, put a bevel, change it to angle, set it to like 60, and then just go from there. So it's just duplicating pieces and just building up the model. Put a ring in there, another circular divot. Like I said, these circular rounded divots that connect to metal textures just look great. That's one thing I noticed on Metal Gear people. You want your human to look like a robot, slap a barcode on his forehead. But sorry, I'm just ranting here. Um, these are just things that I've noticed that have become a little bit cliche in the Metal Gear universe. Which, I mean, I'm not bashing on it. I love their boss design. Their bosses are the most epic looking ever. But there's a lot to learn from it because they use a lot of recurring motifs. So now I'm trying to build just a little shoulder accent to stick up. No more looking at the low poly model. Now I'm full confidence in private mode, working with the beauty piece. And let me tell you, life is good. While I'm thinking about it, I was watching an Iron Man video not too long ago where they were just modeling one in Cinema 4D, and the result was pretty nice, but I was wondering, as I was watching it, like, wow, Cinema 4D must be a little hard. But not only that, but also that, it may be hard to make that particular suit. Like, I never try aiming at intellectual property that's kind of approximated by eye. But, I bet using this type of workflow, you would be able to easily make a Mark II, like Iron Man style suit. Just using this exact same workflow. And in the video that I saw, their workflow was not as good. It was pretty horrible. It was like put verts in space, insert planes, and pull them on the X and Y. And that's like old school modeling. Blender has evolved. So now you don't just come in and just build it like he did back in 2.49. You bring in a cube, I mean, you could bring in a cube or a plane and just delete all the verts, use the skin modifier, start building a shape and then sculpt, or you could just bring in a cube, go into sculpt mode, turn on dynamic topology, and just snake hook your way into a, half torso and just go from there. So for the helmet, I tried going for that skull like I was telling y'all about, but in the end, I ended up abandoning the design and ended up asking my good friend Tony for some help on things to improve with the design element because I didn't want it to have such an insectoid appearance, but I wasn't sure exactly what to do. Sometimes whenever you're working on a model for a long time, you tend to fall asleep on it or fall in love with it and end up missing critical elements that will help you vastly improve and continue moving forward with it. So that's another reason why I think the idea of a Blender Hangout would be interesting, not to mention that it would be good to interact with other users and see progression, because I am watching quite a few artists grow at astounding rates, and it's all through this whole social interactive live art scene that I was just not aware of until now. So making cylinders and connecting them up to form plugs and connecting them adds interest. Adding loop cuts, beveling them, scaling the alternate side, and then putting credential cuts on both sides also make it interesting. So you see me using cheap tricks just on random pieces just to add just slight visual cues to add to the model. This model needs a neck, so nothing complicated. Just bring in a cylinder or a circle and just extrude it up. Put bevels, scale it out Shogun style, credential loop, credential loop, credential loop, and smooth. Bring that in, bevel. Bring this in, pull it in, bevel. And what are we going to do? We're going to pull that out, pull that back in, harden these two up with the bevel, and voila. So I could just have a hose going all the way up the middle, and that would be a functional concept. But, still on with the experimentation with it. Well, let me tell you, these matte caps are fantastic. It's one of the best things that has been added to Blender recently. Like when I saw that Tan Rusendel personally added it himself, I was like, whoa. But it is definitely fantastic to have them. I mean, the old way was horrible using GLSL shading, which is kind of CPU intensive to just display something of this caliber. I mean, this is almost a tuned cycles render, but maybe 5 passes, filter, maybe that equivalent, but just a matte cap, just a viewport with hardly any CPU overhead. It's just a fantastic addition. So it's something I just don't see enough in tutorials. But another thing is stay off the brown one. Too many people are using a brown matte cap. But eventually Blender will add support for us to customize what we have here, which is something that I can't wait for. So now, bam, jumping into texture stage. So the first thing I want to do, of course, is put a wall in the background so the sky's not reflecting, and increase my samples, and just take a look at what I got here. So the first light I always add is, of course, the sunlight. The sunlight gives you just fantastic customizable shadows. In addition to that, I'm using an add-on called Sun Position, which tunes the sky and the sun to be a time of day and in a place of the world and per year, per day, all sorts of things. It is just a fantastic add-on for Blender. Let me tell you, like I show it to people that don't use it and they're just like, whoa. Like these people that I hang out with now, I show them all sorts of things about Blender and they're just like, I didn't know it could do that, didn't know it could do that, didn't know it could do that. But I mean, Blender is a blockbuster of a program that is yet to really explode in the professional scene. So, I mean, all you people that are getting good at it, just gear up, because one day they're going to realize that there is a lot of power in the software that will make a lot of one horse riders pretty redundant. But, now to discuss materials. So, the material workflow that I use here is fairly simple. I'm just selecting edge loops and dropping my magic paint mats on it. And the result that you see in the second window speaks for itself. However, to get more complexity out of it, I do of course go through and create some busted paint shaders, which I even do a small featurette in this video on, so stay tuned for that. Where's my navy? So I apply the navy, and after hiding certain pieces, now I can just select random pieces at will, make them navy, and just, you know, further this look. So the only thing lacking is the helmet. At this point, I'm like, ugh, this helmet is killing me. I know it. Like, I have to get something done about it, but doesn't matter. Time to build my light reflecting gobo. Just get a bunch of planes, turn off camera, make sure the normals are facing the right way. And turn on emission. Like I said, make sure the normals are facing the right way. Then add an emission material. And I decide on a 1000 by 2000 comp. That way I can catch them like a RoboCop bus. Here's the first layer, looking absolutely horrible. Must go away. So the main things that I enjoyed here with this particular stage of the model was the fact that the shoulders and the chest are sloping down, right? So the sloping down indicates a more humanoid form, because there is of course the trapezius in the back of the neck that slopes down, that I see that a lot of new people miss on their 3D models. So that is an important part to focus on. So if you're modeling this from scratch or imitating my workflow, just do keep that area in mind, because if you have your arms up too high, your robot will look like it's lurching, and that's something that I think may have happened to me in my practice videos. So I try putting some things on the head and the front, you know, similar to my space captain thing that I did a bit back that was not liked. However, that made it look worse, and I wasn't sure exactly if it was the best design choice to go with. So after slapping on more so material setups to just try to, sorry, getting some messages here, losing my train of thought. Alright, so I decided to take a couple of tests of just changing the materials, just play with different types and color schemes. And this is like my favorite stage, is making indexes and just switching out colors and just really getting down with the design element of it to try to make the model more appealing. And in the end, while I think I ended up going back to almost the original look, so rotate the model, and this is actually where part 1 ends of these 2-hour mega block that has now been condensed into about 41 minutes. So that concludes the first part of this particular lecture on hard surface modeling. So, you know, I think I'm just going to screw around for a while and stick these in the back of the head. Yeah, and that'll work. So I think adding these forms to it actually added to the silhouette. So it was something I decided to stick with. And so just in the final look, it just kind of looked like it could be boosters or whips or swords or just something epic that could be coming out of his body, chargers, you know, just a Duracell bot. But, you know, whatever the case is, that's the end of part 1. So part 2, I started out rendering it and just drawing kind of what I was wanting to do here. And then my pen glitches. You know, and then I keep drawing, you know, I want some hoses going here, want holes there, cut there, you know, buttons there, some lines connecting them, you know, just make them look awesome. So this chapter is titled Making It Awesome, because right now it's a nice looking model, a render beauty, but it's not awesome yet. But, you know, is it up to me to really say it's awesome? Maybe. So, first thing is to get the back, choose some music, and just use dynamic topology. Same workflow as last time. Just mass out just a look to cut up with topology, and then I'm on the way. And so when it comes to robots, something that's hard to find at times can be their backs. So I went to, you know, try to sculpt in a type of sci-fi backpack on the model, and so I'm just pulling in shapes and playing around here, and just cutting in more and more. But the goal is definitely to try to care as little as possible and just try to model with absolute freedom. Um, which is something that I struggle with. Sometimes I try to jump in and be really controlled with the cube. You know, you can't be too domestic with a cube. Cube has only eight verts. It cannot handle you going in too rough with it. However, I did have a fun time experimenting with the new enhancements of ZBrush by building some rocks in Blender and then Z remeshing it, which is something that I want to talk about much later. But back to the video and focusing. Alright, so I actually just found out that I'd been talking to my computer for an hour and it did not record me. So I'll definitely try to say it and not sound like very angry, mad, don't feel like doing this anymore. But I actually do feel like doing this because I am excited about this model. Now, whenever it came to the back, of course, I added a decimate modifier and then just applied it to simplify it because only the forms, shapes, and planes are what matters here, because the geometry, of course, will be smoothed by subsurf. If I already said that, my apologies, but it is something that is worth remembering, because when it comes to building this sort of stuff, I see that there is definitely a workflow that is Blender powered that can get a result much quicker than any other program. So just keep that in mind. And so we'll just cover up these pieces and build the back. And so instead of solidify, I use choice extrusions because I don't expect too much of the body to be seen. And then if it does come down to that, I'll turn on double shaded or use a really thin solidify in order to just keep the path tracing to work correctly. But once you begin, you know, getting in and retopologizing this, things start to get a lot better, much faster. So, you know, you're looking at the sculpt, you're like, where am I going to start with this thing? You know, just get in there, just start tracing it, harden it up to pieces, or just get in there, trace it all the way, and then separate the pieces and harden them up. But either way, just get in there and do it. Oh, sorry about the delay. I was looking at I actually am working on trying to be in a contest on sculpting a musical character of my choosing in ZBrush, and someone is commenting saying that they've made the same guy already previously for no reason, but now I just see I have to outdo their model. But back to the model at hand. So by separating the pieces out, just the usual tricks, extruding, expanding, filling in the cracks. It's important to fill in the cracks. With it being simple, it's nothing to do. So I pretty much use the same workflow for the front as working with the back, turning off the mirror and all of that, and just going through the process. And just extruding and hardening the edges and just bringing that form together, making sure everything clicks like puzzle pieces, so that way whenever the hips turn, these pieces will just kind of slide into each other, maybe on the bevel, and possibly eat and hide any sort of inadequacies to reduce the amount of bones that I have to use during the rigging process. So, it's just, as long as you follow anatomy, you can at least make it slide the way that things would on the human body, or at least that's my experiences with this whole robot rigging session. So now just slapping on the materials, just making each piece unique. And just merge all the pieces together. Yeah, I can't believe I actually narrated this whole hour and did not know that my mic was off. But focusing back, so this part is called level 2ing. I built all of these doodads at work, and now I just copy and pasted them in my file. Scaling them down and putting them on the side, I can now grab them at the time that I want and begin just throwing them into the model. However, notice that I immediately make the mistake of moving the model over there to merge with it instead of just duplicating it like I was actually supposed to. So with that happening, that means that that asset is lost and is now connected, which is kind of a pain. I don't even think I realized it till later that it happened, but whatever. So now just rotate them to be kind of congruent with the surface, but at least enough that I can connect it and it won't look too bad. And I do want the bulges, but I do want the bulges to be relaxed coming off of the metal and not being like too extreme. So that's something that I struggle with at this part, but in the end, I get a fairly good result. However, there is a loop between the two of them that has only one loop. But that'll work for this. So now this piece is separated, moved over to another layer, wire turned off, another piece merged with it, and I too join this one up with it after rotating its orientation. To just be a connector to the surface. And this is, so he can connect it to his USB docking station, download 50 billion more songs for his space adventures. And the differences of the gray to the blue wasn't working, so reducing that and making more of it blue, I can now just grab the next piece, bring it in, and also begin just dropping doodads on the surface after adding edge loops to give it the amount of loops that's needed in order to correctly just drop these doodads on it. So F2 in your way to success can sometimes be a bad thing if you do it too fast, like right here. I had to actually take a moment, stop, think about topology, because the main goal is to ensure that I don't have any span to go across my circle, because once a span crosses my circle, it's no longer a circle. And now with that connected, this definitely adds quite a bit to the model. However, I do of course have to slide some edges away to get them to work right. But the complexity that's added by this sort of thing definitely helps it sell over to the viewer. So adding doodads is good for, the surface, especially for this particular type of modeling. And to remain consistent, gotta continue adding them on all the other segments. So this workflow you see me use here is basically what I call level 2. Now level 3 would be me going in and actually making more subcuts here just in between these bevels and making just even more light catching details while trying to add a little bit more intricacy to the materials and maybe even being more direct with exactly choosing where I want to place it, which isn't something that I'm doing at this moment. Really, I'm just following my eyes as choosing the color schemes and just going with what works. And this is the part where the carbon material makes its debut. So by taking a series of circles, rendering them using internal and shadeless against a black background, I was able to create a carbon material that I then could use using to modulate two separate materials and also displace it. So that's where this shader comes from that you see me import. So later on I do another smaller featurette that'll actually show me making materials for the chip paint, but for that one I actually just made it externally like the doodads. But you know, you see the shapes that are used there. They are fairly simple to create. All I did was just go through just different Pinterest pages, just looking at other people's models and just seeing what kind of parts they had on theirs that looked like they would be interesting to imitate. And so just by making my own extrudes and just projecting from view, I'm able to just only assign these particular faces, use UVs and from near scale to perfection. And this gives me a very nice look on my model, especially since I felt it was lacking something and the carbon material was just what I needed. I mean, I even see places now where I could have put it that definitely would have helped sell the look of the model, as well as the placement of different parts that would have helped more optimally sell the design. But, you know, retrospect, those sort of things are nothing to worry about. I mean, I try to apply the carbon to the middle, and it does not work out. I mean, that UV seam, just stretching nasty. Make sure the normals are the right direction. So each piece is getting gradually moved over to the other layer where I'm individually treating it to just make sure that it looks good enough to be on this level 2 layer and just adding in carbon occasionally. This was a nice little doohickey that I felt was important to have added to the hip area, just, you know, kind of like something for the hoses to connect with or like a service port. Applied a mirror, joined them together, and now they're both mirrored. Of course, I had to rotate it in order to just get it to be a little more interesting. Um, and for some of these buttons, I just can just sync them in and get away with it. For other ones, I have to actually integrate it with the geometry. But these things all are um, just elements of the design that I think helped get it to the final part that I worked so hard towards. And so these things seem a little out of place. I'll just relocate them. Don't want to lose them just yet. They're part of the form. Now to just mass add all the pieces. Now to duplicate and make this piece an actual polygon piece that's not containing so many tries, because it doesn't even look like I even tried. And so that's the only downside to using a partial bevel, is sometimes it can result in creating a lot of triangles. But like I said, triangles are something that aren't really a big deal when you know how to control them, so I always just come back and deal with them in the end. And so for the eye shape, I dropped in an eye and just chose to try to attach it, even though it was against the original design plan that I had at the beginning. I still decided that it was worth trying to go through, even though it probably wasn't the best idea to try to go through. So I joined it together, and it ends up giving it a kind of a frog face on the mask. So I do take a quick break to just kind of concept a better plan for going about it. So you'll see that in just a moment. The pieces are all connected smoothly. And so that was the render, and as you can see, it's not looking absolutely good. So I do try playing with it, moving it around a bit to try to get a more appropriate look. Still wasn't digging the look. In fact, why is he looking out using bolts on his face? It just doesn't seem very natural, so I end up discarding that particular setup and just redesigning the head from scratch. So that's something you'll see me do. Now, from here, I actually just go into Krita and begin drawing pictures of just ideas on what I think the head should look like, since I wasn't pleased with the current one. So, Krita is definitely a program worth checking out. I even did a video about it previously where I talk about how it has the best brushes of Scribbler 2, the shape brushes from Alchemy, the mirror of Sketchbook Pro, the filters of Photoshop and transform skills of Photoshop, the layer grouping that is of Photoshop, blend types, and all those goodies, as well as full brush customization options, more manageable behaviors, and some pretty unique things that Photoshop doesn't have, like filter layers and stuff like that. However, it doesn't have blending modes, which isn't necessarily a big deal, but it is something I've noticed. And so I go through a couple of more designs and then start trying to go for just full body, just imagining poses and then going back. One of my favorite things to do is just draw gestures, sketches, using a sketch brush, because the lines just kind of do all the work for you of helping just build up shapes and whatnot. So now I'm playing with the shape brush, like the one that's actually used in Alchemy, and just putting a mask on it to just try and create some shapes here. So I like the recurring motif of a helmet that kind of protrudes into the back. However, I didn't want anything that was too large, or else I, give my character predator head, which wouldn't be good for this, sleek space ninja type design. I even tried just drawing a value sketch of my robot with his hand out, Iron Man style, but in the end I just get rid of it. Do a little just goofing off with the pixel brush, and getting back to work on just trying to figure out a design. And in that sketch, the thought was born that maybe I should give my robot an epic cape. So that is something I do later on in the video. However, the thought is just kind of on just the top, just as a final touch to just add that. So now back to work to just create more pieces to put on the head. And so now to make the helmet, I just go in and begin sculpting the head to try to just come up with some sort of design. So I have an idea of the type of look I'm going to go for, so it's just a matter of just sculpting it in, tracing it over with topology, and just going through the same workflow of just hardening the edges, creasing it, and getting that finished look. You know, when it comes to sculpting, I'm just looking at just plane changes and just how topology lines will randomly break all this stuff up into more intricate parts and how it's just going to slope. So with the trim dynamic, that's just where I'm working on just how the pieces are going to interconnect. So I mean, all the trim pieces are like bevels, or at least that's how I'm looking at it in my head. So that old head's days are numbered. So while the previous mask had a severe case of frog face, I'm glad I caught on to that because the old me, or the me from like 3 months ago, would have stuck with that and not even had the intelligence to ask someone else for critique on it and just go with a bad design. And it's just embarrassing, you know, to come back and look at a model and realize that you did a poor design back then. I mean, I guess it's just a stage of everyone developing as an artist, but I do, of course, try to push the envelope to try to improve um, through every project. I mean, I want my YouTube to just show me just going all the way from noob to pro, from my first video on character development to my more recent videos on it. You can just tell that there's an evolution in the characters and the anatomy and the supporting features that just make it so much easier. And these are just key things that are important to the model. So oh, I'm so exhausted. Sorry, guys. Sorry, YouTube. Yeah, I'm pretty bushed. Like I said, I've been depriving myself of quite a bit of sleep lately to work on this model, and then in addition to that, still working, even though that seems to take a lot out of me. But you know, whenever you're in the modeling zone, sometimes you just can't stop modeling. You just gotta keep at it. And really, the people that I'm interacting with now online while actually doing 3D is definitely helping it as far as making 3D less boring and less of a one-man endeavor, and just kind of turning it into a team effort where, you know, everybody's just talking. I mean, about random things. Like I make jokes about it all the time, like it's talking to my software, and I definitely want to bring the same thing to Blender. So, you know, if I get enough comments in the video, I might be able to get something done and have an open source room made. Y'all can get in on the goodness. So just more tracing and retopology on the head. And just more filling in shapes and connecting it. So, you know, I do want this to be segmented so that way it has that level of intricacy. However, I don't want it to um, be overlapping to the point that it becomes an irritation whenever it comes to completing the level 2 modeling, which is extruding these pieces in and expanding them out. And of course, adding bevels and divots and stuff like that to the model. So the same workflow as I used on the body, just being duplicated on the head, and just hardening those loops just makes the subsurf work so much better. I mean, I don't even need matcap view in order to see how good things are coming out here. Um, it is just a matter of just getting in there, solidifying it, and just making sure you don't see any gaps. And with that, I have a pretty good helmet going. So now it's just a matter of just getting in material magic. So by linking the colors, I have all the materials in the same index row. So if I merge these objects together, I won't offset the materials at all. And then on top of that, everything is congruent. So just coming in here first with the paints, then with the carbon, and then of course do some fine tuning on these little pieces and parts that you see that are slightly exposed. So as you can see, the results are coming along quite well. Just using a combination of kit bashing with polygonal modeling, you're able to get a more controlled result that looks more believable. So that's that's one of the many things that I did learn through the course of completing this project. But the design changes that I went through over the course of this model were quite immense, but it definitely was a very, very fun project that came up with a very rewarding result. And usually with modeling, sometimes it can take a moment to get that big reward until the very end when you finally are looking at a composite or, a perfected render. So, robots, I don't know, are almost immediately gratifying to me. So you still see at this point, there's one place that still could use some carbon, definitely, and that's in the middle of the face. So watch this next render when it comes out, the amount of improvement that it shows just from adding it there, because the current setup is leaving it very boring. But I actually think it's because I didn't actually do a UV map at this time when I did add the carbon material on there. So if you add a material that does have an image and is set to UV, make sure you have UVs that are actually there to be able to show it, or else it'll just be gray. So curves and meshes, how do they go together? Well, it's simple. A couple of things to keep in mind is when you got a circle and you shoot it up into a cylinder and then you deform it with a curve, you can either add a modifier to the mesh and then point it to the curve, or you can select the mesh, then select the curve, and then press Control P, and it'll actually allow you to use the parent options to use curve deform. Now, whenever you're using the curve to deform the object, you have the choice between the X, Y, or Z axis. And by choosing it correctly, you're able to get the cube to deform. Right now, it took me the longest for some reason to realize that X, Y, and Z meant in the 3D view. So if you have your model arrayed going up, you want to choose Z so that way it deforms it correctly and have your curve also going up versus to the left for X and to the back for Y. And while that might be a no-brainer to some of y'all, it was kind of news to me when I finally realized it, because I just kind of clicked whichever one's random, because one of my rotations are always off for some reason. And by using just the power of curves, the arrays, curve fit array, array fit curve, and the mirror, I'm able to just really quickly add complex hoses and stuff like that to this model. So definitely powerful and useful, and a little bit better than using just curves and then a Bezier circle as the bevel object. And so now this completes part 2, and now beginning part 3. So this is the final chapter of this part 1 video. With it being a 2-hour video, I guess even I can burn myself out over the process of doing these narrations. So sorry if I sound like I'm losing interest or some of my thoughts are fading out, but oh Christ, doing director's commentary for movies must be horrible by the time you're done with the movie, watching it in post, going through the process of making it, already seeing it in the final version, but still having to watch it go through the whole creation process again. Yeah, it can kind of drive you crazy, but I have made a promise to myself that every time a video gets 500 views, I'm going to make a new video. So I also want to go back and do a small prequel to this one that is just going to be hard surface basics, where I actually just go real time and just explain, just from my perspective, hard surface modeling, because Blender Cookie has their way, E3D has their way, all these different people have different techniques for it, but I've come up with like my own kind of mutated workflow for getting these sort of things done. So something I was not expecting to actually make in this video was the legs. The legs were tremendously fun to make. I learned a lot. The workflows were unique, and I've never really approached them the way that I did in this particular video. So you'll definitely see an interesting workflow for the way that I assemble them. So our first strategy was to split it up into pieces, solidify it, bring in cube planes, areas to represent kneecaps, shins, and then from there create circular curve arrays that spiral, that were latticed, that were connecting from point A to point B to simulate that kind of muscle fiber you see on the suits in Crisis, right? So if that sounds like it makes no sense, then maybe it also doesn't make any sense that to make this suit transform around a person, my thoughts on it personally are to use a combination of shape keys, corrective shape keys, and an action constraint along with the driver added to a rig. So I think if I did that, I could actually make it transform by just creating multiple shape keys that went through stages of transforming from one key to another key to keep it under control and have them swerve around the body and then just control the order in a small animation and actually make that action a action constraint to a bone, so I could just move a bone and it will just slide off, and then move it back and it will slide back on. And I'm pretty sure I could be smart and even get bones involved with it too, but expect some great things to come out of this. Or maybe it'll disappear, you never hear from it again, but no, I'm getting better at finishing my models too. Because it is kind of bad I don't have a demo reel. Like, I don't have a particular need for one, but I do want one so that way people can see my current skill level. So I move it to another layer, and these are more doodads, right? This is botDeuxV268. I made these the next day at work, and I was just like, alright, I'm gonna just slap them on this robot, see how it works out. So of course, shin pad, gotta go samurai with it. And I even built a simplified anatomical arm, but realized that maybe I should build an arm in the video. I can't just be taking too many shortcuts. But really with these doodads, it was like 4 hours making them, but I wasn't so much making them because I was slow, but because I was just trying to just make certain ones that caught my eye that I thought would work with this particular theme. But I do feel now in retrospect that the leg design isn't very congruent with the actual body design. So I might come back in a later video and make some changes to actually try to get the two to look like they're made by the same manufacturer, but it could just be me. But I mean, if it's something that you notice in it at the end result, do let me know, of course. And so with the knife, you know, there's knife to cut, and then there's knife to cut. There's, you know, press K, you have the knife, and then there's press Z, and you have the knife that cuts through. And by cutting through the mesh on the Z, you're able to just cut through like everything. So that's something worth knowing. But I'm pretty sure all these tips are things that all you Blender watchers are familiar with now. But what I should do is start telling you about some of these newer features that are coming out that I'm not even aware of yet all the time until I actually reread them again. But I mean, if you aren't subscribed to Adventures in Blender on Google Plus, you should definitely check into him because he's absolutely fantastic. So for the body, I just put all the parts at sub D1 using the modifier panel that I have on the right. Also, I think I want to make a video coming back talking about just the scripts that I use in Blender and why I like them, like the sky one and some of the ones that people have suggested to me in comments that were just really phenomenal, because I was reading about some of the top add-ons for Blender that people were fans of, and some of them I'd never even heard of before. Like there's one that lets you just drag keyframes in the timeline to do retiming instead of having to use the dope sheet. And while that sounds a little trivial, that is absolutely fantastic. So right here you see me beginning to put hoses in the leg and just move them around. So I try to go for a simplified approach of doing it one by one, but you'll see that this idea rapidly mutates and turns into something a little bit easier and more friendly. However, I think if I would have kept it simple, it would have remained a little bit more practical and less busy visually, but that's up to you to decide whenever I get to the conclusion. So now we are at the 1 hour and 30 minute mark, so 38 minutes, so we're definitely moving along in this thing, and all these videos seem to be getting quite long. It is because the amount that I'm trying to shove into them is just a lot. I mean, I would really like to make a series that went all the way to production that wasn't a 40-hour series. I mean, a 40-part series that is just too long to watch. I mean, I used to try to watch every Blender video ever made, but I've seen one too many videos on how to make a cup, and I just can't. I just can't bring myself to watch videos like I used to. Like I used to just marathon them. But I mean, I'll watch the big people like Andrew Price, but not every John, Mac, and Charlie. I can't be just stuck on YouTube. I'll be stuck forever. I mean, sometimes I feel like tutorials are pretty crippling, just because before people even want to try a project, they're already trying to see other people's workflows without even experimenting, and this takes away the magic of ingenuity and kind of nails down a way that may not even be correct as the way to do something. And really, people should experiment for themselves, then see how other people do it, then match their current skill set up to what it is they're trying to do based off of how they done it, how other people did, and what they feel is easiest, and then actually complete it through like what I consider to be a mutated workflow, which most of the stuff that I do is as a result of, I would say, workflow mutation, right? Like, I'm not an anatomy major, like I don't know all the pieces, but I've come up with this way of breaking it down into geometric shapes where I can almost build it if I just have cubes and triangles and polygons to just bend around and create a proxy shape. I can actually visualize it, but it's just my own way. Like, in fact, this mech that we're making right here is my own version of, I guess, Eat3D's kind of mech version 2, right? Like, they went through and did hard surface tracing on it, and then just messed with all the pieces. So I even did a Cyberboy not too long ago, like sometime last year, that also had a slightly different workflow. So I mean, what you're seeing here is a complete evolution. It may not even work for you, but if it doesn't, then don't lose hope. It still is something worth trying. But I mean, I see a lot of tutorials now where I have to just pause it and just go and try what it is that I'm seeing, because what I saw was so unbelievable. Like, is it really that easy? And the answer is yeah. So now, adding the easy lattice creator, I'm able to just go in, scale, and just create muscle. And this is where things begin to get filled in a lot quicker. But like I said, I do feel that this makes the model a little busy, because the rest of the body is pretty ergonomic, and there's not even any tendinous wires showing around the arm area, yet the legs are, bursting with wires. Maybe it's a runner bot or something, who knows. But with the leg, I did try to just kind of emulate the anatomy that would actually be with the human leg, but trying to go with a like crisis style type of build, while not while trying to not break the mesh continuity too much, right? Because now these pieces at the bottom are sinking into the bottom leg panel, so that's something I need to do something about. But for now, I just need to get these shapes in, get the form covered, and then go back and actually do corrections. So by adding this muscle on the other side, I think it might have been my design nail in the coffin for this particular leg. But I do some proportion changes at the end in order to make it just fit with the rig and with the model, because it looked like it was either too big or too small. But whatever the case was, there was something wrong with my leg. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And now comes the part of trying to just merge this stuff together. Before merging it all, what you want to do is turn off the subsurf modifiers, because you don't want to apply a subsurf if you don't absolutely have to, because your first reaction when you see it again is, of course, to add a subsurf again, but you know, density for no reason is just not even worth it. So you do want to click on the 0 to turn off the subsurf, then come in and actually just apply the modifiers, which will apply the mirror or curve or array or whatever the case is, so that way you can just get in there and start editing it. So this piece I felt needed to be flattened and inverted and hardened. But you see, just 4 loops added to any 2 set loop will just crease the hell out of it. And merge all of those and solidify this piece and apply it. So if you select 2 vertices and press J, you will cut directly between them all the way across space, or all the way across the model. So while that sounds a little confusing, it's just something you have to try. Just select a vert on the other side, press J. If you're the kind of person like me who uses the hyper knife of just cutting his way to success, adding in detail wherever he sees fit, then yeah, the J is powerful. Like, I saw that one in the added on, and I just was beside myself. It's amazing. So, and the model's moving on, adding just more bevels to try to complexify the form. But as things get smoother, you see that things start to look a little bit more like they work. And the goal here is to make it look like it works, and also make it where it animates like it could work. Because whenever I animate, I don't want all these wires just jumping out everywhere. So yeah, there's definitely going to be some design revisions made in the next video. However, at this time, I will just stick with what I have now until more of the form becomes clear. But we're moving along now. Now I'm able to get back focused on this. But like I said, I actually recorded an hour of me just talking nonsense to my computer, and it did not record me, so I'm a little upset about it, but no worries. But I do like the leg. The leg does look cool. I think it could work on a Mac. Definitely something to add to the asset pile. And just gotta hide these muscles deeper up in the leg. I also think I could have stood to make variances of these muscle fibers, right? Because the hoses that are on the left that are bunched up look the same as the ones that are just standard hoses that I was kind of thinking would be used to like pump fluid or something along those lines. So that is definitely a problem. So now what I do is separate everything out, merge it together, and now have what is called the upper leg. Of course, after applying the mirror. And so that's that. And that is all that there is for the legs. So I can take all of these curves and delete them, unhide the legs, and bring them back. And now comes the fun part, dropping the paint, or actually setting up the rotations first. Bring that part down because it's penetrating. And now it can bend convincingly and still kind of hide how it's built. So if there were still curves, I could have used hooks and just done like some dynamic rigging setups, but I just chose not to go that route. And so here's one of my first flaws, right? So the leg, alright, so the leg is too low. The leg needs to go up a little bit more, but this is something that I don't notice for quite a moment until my girlfriend actually points it out to me. So if you can't see that, then your eyes still have some growing to do, but if you do see it, you definitely see that the legs are too low. And so it's giving them kind of a lowrider, desperado kind of look, and that's not something that I'm wanting here. So I play with the legs for a while to try to move them, but in the end it turns out that I just was having to make changes to the rigging. So to take a break from all that, I just go through and apply some random materials to certain key parts of the mesh. Alright, now back after a short break and continuing on adding different materials to the model. Just using my edge loop magic to just get interesting colors. And of course, can't leave out any of the trim. This part needs to be mirrored, expanded. It also needs an internal cutting loop cut. And voila, now it is complete. So now from here, it's time to move the camera for the first time since I began making it. And just assign some colors to certain pieces that just seem to be lacking. So the first thing I do, of course, is render it. Just take a quick look. And it still hasn't hit me yet that the legs are still too low. And I bring this up for so much because it is something that I see quite a bit in other files, especially people that are new to software or just modeling in generals, that the anatomy of the legs, the hips do protrude out, but but for something like this, you would want them to begin a little bit higher up in the body. So once I pull them up, it'll definitely be a dramatic improvement almost immediately. But I mean, it really isn't that bad the way it looks right now. You could definitely stick with that, but it does give it a bit of a kind of too mechanical type of look to it, in my opinion. And of course, more carbon on the legs. Alright, so now, just in a new file, I decided that I'm going to go ahead and make a small featurette about creating shaders for Scratch Paint, or at least my workflow for it. So this is, of course, a workflow that I'm using at the moment. However, it is, of course, subject to change, especially with my recent adventures with using the normal mapping and converting bumps to that, and using it instead of the displacement, which I don't really like using displacement too much because it requires I connect to the end of the node and doesn't allow for a whole lot of customization with it being mixed with other nodes. But I think it just looks a little bit better in the viewport than the normal nodes do. So first I bring in an image from CG Textures after Smart UV unwrapping it, and then I just hook up a color ramp and use a diffuse node to see it, while I then just come in and just mix the two using that as a factor. So there I get paint material number 1. So this paint material is all fine and dandy, however the paint is stuck to the surface, so now I need to actually experiment with the displacement. So by using those same clamped RGB values, I'm able to control exactly how corroded the paint is on the surface. So that completes it. So there will be 2 rows of materials. There will be cracked A, cracked B, where there will be variances between the two. So that's the first one out of the way. So now on to number 2. For this one, I'm going to create a control node using RGB and then a series of hue saturations to just modulate the color differences that are actually here in this particular paint shader. So it's like red to dark red to lighter red with the white on top. So by plugging an RGB curve and using these nodes, I'm able to just get that same look, but just using one color node, so I can just have an absolute color changer. And that is important. So I start off with my regular shader and load my next image from CG Textures, Smart UV project, drag it over, and just experiment with hacking and slashing on these. So of course I first connected and it's completely wrong, but when I reverse it, it's back right. And here we have the second shader set up. So with the alternative diffuse, I don't even mess with it because, you know, I was trying to make it kind of like a muddy, like, I don't know, it's like that material you see on cars that's run through the mud a whole bunch. But I was just trying to create a material for it. So my goal was to make a scratch paint and then create an alternative one that was either negative or using displacement versus the other one not using it, or something along those lines. And so once again, the same workflow, this time using an alternate shader and loading in my third image of just random concrete. I'm able to connect it up and fine tune it with the color ramp to ensure that there's no easy transitions between the paint and the corrosion, like so. Alright, so for being here narrating this whole video, I myself deserve a gold medal. So now with my fancy shaders that I made over in another blend file, I'm just going to go ahead and bring those in. So you see I have two versions of Blender over on my taskbar on the right. One of them is actually V-Ray Blender, which is something I've been experimenting for upcoming videos, but I didn't render this in V-Ray at all. However, maybe I should in the next segment because V-Ray is awesome, but the render times ramp up so bad and so fast. But enough about that. To open a multiple instance Blender, you just right click Blender and click the logo again. You can actually open a second one, find another 3D program that can do that, and I think Modo can actually, but other than Modo, find another 3D program that's able to do that. So my workflow for creating a scratch pane is pretty easy. Bam, just UV unwrap and it just works itself out, and you just really cannot beat that. So merge everything, split. However, there is a piece that does not actually get connected properly, but we'll come back to that. And so I was a particularly big fan of this particular method of just throwing the shaders in and just using rough UV unwrappings to get the texture to match. It's something that I found quite a bit of enjoyment in, especially because I've tried everything from vertex painting and dirty maps and just clamping it against these textures to just damaging it physically and going through like ZBrush or Blender to try to put these cuts in and create this type of material myself. But now I see that there's an easy way to do it and there's a not so easy way, but I am all for that easier way. And also keep in mind cycles. To view an image on a texture, it's Alt-C, but you have to have that node selected in the image editor. But you don't see me having an issue with that on my end, but it is something that can sometimes happen. So I need to connect his balls. And see, what I should have done was made a carbon material that also was corroded, so that way I could just replace the carbon in the scene with the corroded carbon mat and people would be none the wiser. But the helmet is something I'm especially pleased with, especially because this is probably my 20th helmet of just like sci-fi helmets. I mean, maybe I should apply for a job at 343. And there we go. And so if the material's been assigned and it's still not showing it, it's probably because there's not UV coordinates available for it. And voila. So the next thing is to bring in this human meta rig, which I then use to just rig and control a model, because showing off preview renders of it in T-pose is just not good enough anymore. Not after the things that I have seen. People don't even sculpt in T-pose anymore. People just sculpt in just a dynamic pose and still get all the anatomy correct. So with that, even if I can't just model in dynamic poses, I can at least pose them dynamically in the end by setting up a simple rig to control the joints, especially for something like a robot. It's just lazy to not do it. And at this point it never occurred to me that the amount of modifications I was doing to this rig might be indicating that there's some construction issues with the overall design of the robot. But assigning everything to each piece isn't very difficult. I just select the piece, select the bone, Control P, map to bone. For just these simple initial poses, I can get away with it, but for animation, I may have to come up with something a little more sophisticated using a series of track twos and copy rotations with lowered influences to try to get these muscles to move along with the leg, but not so much to try to keep the realism from breaking like during a run cycle. But thinking about that at this point is unnecessary, especially because I'm already talking about going back and redesigning some aspects. But making sure everything's parented, applying it, making sure it's not parented to the curve anymore. So Alt P, and then you want to keep the transformations but clear the parent, and then parent it to the bone so it doesn't move an inch. And unfortunately, I realized at this point that for this whole part 3, I didn't even have the screen recording on. So sorry about that, but I mean, it is the same buttons that I'm normally pressing. So I assume that most of the people that are seeing this are not amateurs and have quite a history with this program, especially if you're watching a time-lapse lecture like this, or maybe you're just into cool robots. But whatever the case may be, because the legs are on a mirror, I just cannot find a pose for it that works. And because they're sticking out so far, he has this howdy partner kind of look. So I fight with that for quite a while. And separate. And that's it. Now I can actually get an more interesting pose. But not having feet on a creature is disheartening, and not having an arm on it is also a little bit of a setback. So, no time to sit and drool over how well it came out. It's time to get back to the drawing board. So I even modeled a cape to bring in and use to just show it off, because capes are awesome. So make it a 2000 by 2000 render, frame it up, and voila. So going through the stages and run a test render, and that is actually looking pretty good. The results are sharp. There's a little bit of bloom. I did reduce it from the amount that people were talking about on the internet when I first showed just the original concept. So I experimented with scale on the leg. Did not like the bulkiness. Still could not figure out where this bulkiness was coming from. So I thought even scale on the leg, showing a little bit of foreshortening, would help sell it, but I was just being crazy. But at this point, I did begin to get the feeling that I wanted. I wanted him to look like he was sweeping something out of the way. Just epicness. Cape swooshing, appeared out of nowhere. I've been sent to kill you from the future. That kind of epicness. So in 2.68, they say that cycles is supposed to be 30% faster. So make sure you're not using 2.67. But I mean, 2.68 feels a little bit unstable, but what version of Blender isn't unstable? There's times where I'm using Blender and it will disappear to the desktop so hard without any error message so quickly that I just blink in disbelief and wonder if I ever was even using Blender in the first place, or if I was just hallucinating. If that happens to you, then you definitely are a Blender user, but only this program disappears without a complete trace autosave, no matter what you say. Arg. So now we're just getting near the end of the model, but from here it's just posing. So after turning off location, things get very real, and I'm finally able to move the legs up and actually get a good pose. So y'all might remember in some of my earlier videos I was talking about how I was experiencing issues with my computer running slow and things like that. Gave me some advice on cleaners and things to get the system running better, which wasn't necessarily the issue, but more like my file management and hard drive usage and amount of clutter. But I blew my power supply out the other day. I got off of work and immediately my computer's power supply blew up and died, and I was devastated. I thought I lost my entire life's work. Good thing I didn't. So now in a compositor, adding a blur node and then adding an RGB curve to boost that, and adding a soften. So it takes me the longest to notice that I accidentally set the index to be 21, but eventually I do come back and do it. So after my power supply blew out, I went out and just got a new one, but I mean, it's a 620 watt power supply powering a GTX 580. How much heat could it possibly generate? But it's a funny story because one of my subscribers sent a model to me, and I was talking to him about how cool it looked and how I should go for some sort of hard surface model as well, since he inspired me and I wasn't able to think of anything to do at the time. Hence this model you're looking at now too. But he sent me the model and I was admiring the topology and the setup for it. However, I was lamenting on how there was no shading, like, how come there's not any materials? You could just go on Blend Swap, download these paint materials, start sending them the link. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead, make a beauty render of this, set up some awesome materials, send them a picture, and it'll just be like, whoa. So I start doing that, and I get to the end, and I hit render, and my computer is just off. So now that it's back up, I've already evacuated all my assets to the cloud, but I mean, tragedy strikes. So that's kind of why I also put so many models on Blend Swap, is so in the event my computer destroys all of my life's work, maybe I can have an entire cast of characters there by that time and just be a fight against time, and then also be slowly working my way into getting all these files to the cloud. But compositing, back to that. So yeah, I didn't explain hardly any of this, but I plan on actually going through like a finale of just actually canceling all of this out and going back. But it's my usual cheap tricks of just modulating each pass and then re-adding it to it while just using certain factors. So there's not really a whole lot for me to say to that, except for to make the glow. All I did was take a ID pass, blur it, add it, blur it, add it, and then add the original on top of it, and now I have this glowing circle in all the accent areas.